Relax with stories that help you sleep, work, and calm your mind. Today's story is called The Teacher and the Grown-Up Student. We invite you to listen and support our channel by clicking subscribe and receiving channel notifications to conveniently follow the next videos. Sincerely, thank you. The studio smelled of turpentine and old wood, a scent that clung to the air like a lover's whisper. Tucked in a quiet corner of Seattle's Capitol Hill, the art studio was a haven of creativity, its walls lined with half-finished canvases and shelves brimming with jars of paint. Sunlight spilled through tall, arched windows, casting golden streaks across the hardwood floor, where easels stood like silent sentinels awaiting their artists. It was the first day of the Nude Art, Drawing the Human Form class, a course for adults bold enough to capture the raw beauty of the body on paper. The room buzzed with nervous energy, a mix of anticipation and unease from the 12 students who had signed up, each clutching their sketch pads like shields. At the back of the room, Elena Tran sat quietly, her presence almost unnoticeable amid the chatter of her classmates. At 19, she was the youngest in the class, a freshman at the University of Washington, studying design. Her delicate frame was draped in a loose, cream-colored sweater that slipped off one shoulder, revealing the smooth curve of her collarbone, kissed by a faint summer tan. Her hair, a cascade of jet-black silk, was pulled into a messy bun, with a few rebellious strands framing her heart-shaped face. Her eyes large, almond-shaped, and the color of warm amber held a spark of curiosity that betrayed her otherwise shy demeanor. Those eyes darted around the room, taking in the easels, the charcoal sticks, the nervous laughter of strangers, but they lingered longest on the man standing at the front of the studio. Aiden Clarke was not what Elena had expected. At 35, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen the world and chosen to paint it rather than conquer it. He was tall, just over 6 feet, with a lean, athletic build that suggested he spent as much time hiking the trails of the Pacific Northwest as he did in his studio. His dark brown hair was slightly tousled, streaked with the faintest hints of gray at the temples, giving him an air of rugged sophistication. His jawline was sharp, dusted with a day's worth of stubble, and his eye, a storm gray and piercing, seemed to see straight through to the soul of whoever met his gaze. He wore a fitted black button-down, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle, the kind of arms that could wield a brush with precision or cradle a lover with tenderness. A thin leather cord hung around his neck, disappearing beneath his collar, hinting at a story untold. Aiden's voice cut through the room, low and commanding, as he began the class. "Art is not about perfection," he said, pacing slowly, his boots clicking softly against the floor. "It's about feeling. Every line you draw, every shadow you shade, is a piece of your soul on the page. Today, we're here to capture the human form, not just its shape, but its essence, its vulnerability, its truth." Elena's pencil hovered over her sketch pad, her heart quickening as Aiden's words sank in. There was something about the way he spoke, each syllable deliberate, like a brushstroke on canvas. She watched the way his hands moved as he gestured, long fingers curling gracefully, as if he were sculpting the air itself. His knuckles were slightly scarred, a testament to years spent wrestling with paint and charcoal, and she found herself wondering what those hands would feel like against her skin. The thought made her cheeks flush, and she quickly ducked her head, pretending to adjust her pencils. The model for the die, a woman in her 40s with a dancer's lithe frame, entered the room, shedding her robe with the ease of someone accustomed to being studied. The class fell silent, pencils scratching softly as the students began their work. Elena's strokes were tentative at first, her hand unsteady as she tried to capture the curve of the model's spine, the gentle slope of her hips. She stole glances at her classmates' sketches, feeling a pang of inadequacy. Her lines were too soft, too hesitant, lacking the bold confidence she saw in others' work. Aiden moved through the room, offering quiet feedback. His presence was magnetic, drawing every eye as he leaned over a student's easel or pointed out a subtle detail. When he reached Elena's corner, she froze, her breath catching as he stood behind her. She could feel the warmth of him, the faint scent of cedar and coffee clinging to his clothes. He leaned down slightly, his shoulder brushing hers as he studied her sketch. "You're holding back," he said, his voice soft but firm, meant only for her. "Your lines are beautiful, but they're afraid. Let them breathe. Trust your hand." Elena nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She dared a glance at him, and for a moment, their eyes locked. His gaze was intense, not unkind but searching, as if he were trying to see the thoughts behind her amber eyes. She felt exposed, as if he could see the rapid beat of her heart, the heat creeping up her neck. Then, just as quickly, he straightened and moved on, leaving her with the ghost of his warmth and a sketch pad that suddenly felt too small to contain her emotions. As the class progressed, Elena found herself watching Aiden more than the model. The way he tilted his head when he critiqued a drawing, the slight furrow of his brow when he was deep in thought, the way his lips curved into a rare, fleeting smile when a student got something right. It was all mesmerizing. She noticed the smallest details, the faint scar above his left eyebrow, the way his fingers absently traced the edge of his sketch pad, the subtle flex of his bicep when he crossed his arms. He was a work of art himself, she thought, all sharp angles and quiet strength, a man who seemed both untouchable and achingly human. Aiden, for his part, maintained his professional composure, but there were moments brief, almost imperceptible, when his gaze lingered on Elena. Her sketch pad, filled with delicate, almost ethereal lines, caught his attention more than once. There was something in her work, a rawness that spoke of untapped passion, a sensitivity that mirrored the way her eyes seemed to drink in the world. He noticed the way her fingers gripped the pencil, slender and graceful. Her nails painted a soft peach that contrasted with the charcoal smudges on her skin. Her sweater had slipped further down her shoulder, revealing the elegant line of her neck, and he found himself wondering how it would look rendered in ink, all soft curves and golden light. The class ended too soon, the students packing up their supplies as the model slipped back into her robe. Elena lingered, pretending to organize her pencils, stealing one last glance at Aiden as he spoke to another student. He caught her eye, and for a split second, the air between them seemed to hum with something unspoken. Then he turned away, and she hurried out into the Seattle dusk, her heart racing, her mind replaying every word, every look, every moment. Back at her dorm, Elena sat on her bed, her sketchpad open to the drawing she'd started in class. The model's form was there, but in the margins, she'd unconsciously sketched something else, the outline of a man's hand, strong and scarred, holding a pencil. She traced the lines with her fingertip, her skin tingling as she imagined Aiden's hand guiding hers, his voice in her ear, his breath against her cheek. She closed the sketchpad quickly, as if to trap the thought before it could escape, but it was too late. Something had begun in that studio, something as delicate and dangerous as a single pencil line on a blank page. The next class was a week away, but already, Elena was counting the hours. She didn't know what it was about Aiden Clarke that made her feel so alive, so seen, but she knew one thing for certain. She wanted to draw him, to capture every angle of his face, every shadow of his soul. And maybe, just maybe, she wanted him to see her the same way, not as a student, but as a woman whose heart was already sketching his name in secret. The Seattle rain had begun to fall, a soft drizzle that painted the city in shades of silver and blurred the edges of the world. Inside the Capitol Hill studio, the air was warm, thick with the scent of charcoal and the faint hum of anticipation. The second session of the Nude Art Drawing the Human Form class was underway, and Elena Tran sat at her usual spot in the back, her heart a quiet drumbeat beneath her ribcage. She wore a fitted olive green turtleneck today, the fabric hugging her slender frame, accentuating the gentle curve of her waist and the delicate slope of her shoulders. Her black hair was loose, cascading over one shoulder like a dark river, and her amber eyes were fixed on her sketchpad, though her thoughts were elsewhere on the man who stood at the front of the room, his presence as commanding as a storm. Aiden Clarke was a study in contrast today. His usual black button-down had been replaced by a charcoal gray sweater, the soft fabric clinging to his broad chest and tapering down to his narrow hips. The sleeves were pushed up to his elbows, revealing forearms that were a map of sinew and scars, each line telling a story of late nights spent wrestling with canvas and paint. His storm gray eyes scanned the room as he spoke, his voice a low, velvet rumble that seemed to settle into the bones of everyone listening. "Today, we're focusing on proportion," he said, gesturing to the male model who stood before them, a wiry man in his 30s, with a boxer's compact frame. The human body is a symphony of ratios too, much emphasis on one part, and the whole composition falls apart. Trust your eyes, but let your hands feel the balance. Elena's pencil moved across the page, her strokes more confident than last week, though still laced with a hesitancy that mirrored her own uncertainty. She traced the model's torso, the sharp angle of his collarbone, the taut line of his abdomen, but her mind kept drifting to Aiden. She stole glances at him as he moved through the room, his long strides purposeful, his hands clasped behind his back like a general surveying his troops. She noticed the way his sweater shifted with each movement, hinting at the muscles beneath, the way his lips pursed slightly when he studied a student's work. Her gaze lingered on his hands, those strong, calloused hands that she'd sketched in the margins of her notebook, hands she now imagined tracing the curve of her cheek, the dip of her spine. The class was halfway through when Elena's sketch hit a snag. She'd misjudged the angle of the model's arm, throwing off the entire composition. Her brow furrowed, her teeth catching her lower lip as she tried to erase the offending lines without smudging the rest. She was so focused that she didn't notice Aiden approaching until his shadow fell across her easel, cool and quiet like the rain outside. "You're fighting the paper," he said, his voice soft but carrying that same authority that made her pulse quicken. He stood close, closer than necessary, his body a warm presence just inches from hers. "The arm's too stiff. It needs to flow like water." Elena looked up, her breath catching as she met his gaze. His eyes were intense, the gray of a sky just before lightning, and they held hers for a moment longer than they should have. She nodded, unable to find her voice, her fingers tightening around her pencil. Aiden leaned down, his shoulder brushing hers as he reached for her sketch pad. "May I?" he asked, his tone polite but laced with something deeper, something that made her skin tingle. She nodded again, and then his hand was on hers, guiding her fingers as he adjusted her grip on the pencil. His touch was firm but gentle, his skin warm against hers, the roughness of his calluses a stark contrast to the softness of her own. He moved her hand across the page, sketching a new line for the model's arm, his breath steady and close, stirring the loose strands of her hair. Elena didn't pull away. She couldn't. Her heart was a wild thing, pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. His fingers lingered on hers, just a moment too long, before he released her and stepped back, his expression unreadable. "Better," he said, his voice a touch huskier than before. He straightened, but his eyes didn't leave hers, and in that moment, the rest of the room, the model, the other students, the scratching of pencils faded into a distant hum. There was only Aiden, his tall frame looming over her, his scent of cedar and coffee enveloping her, his gaze pinning her in place like a butterfly on a board. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her breathless, her hands still tingling where he'd touched her. The rest of the class passed in a blur. Elena's sketch improved, but her focus was shattered, her thoughts tangled in the memory of Aiden's hand on hers, the heat of his body so close to her own. When the session ended, she packed her supplies slowly, her movements deliberate, as she watched Aiden from the corner of her eye. He was speaking to another student, but his posture was different now, tenser, as if he were aware of her presence, even across the room. She slung her bag over her shoulder and headed for the door, her heart sinking at the thought of another week before she'd see him again. That night, back in her dorm, Elena couldn't sleep. The rain pattered against her window, a soft rhythm that matched the restless beat of her thoughts. She opened her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard before she began typing an email to Aiden. It was innocent enough, a question about shading techniques, a request for advice on capturing depth in her sketches. But as she wrote, her mind wandered to the way his sweater had hugged his chest, the way his fingers had felt against hers, the way his voice seemed to wrap around her like a caress. She hit send before she could overthink it, her heart racing as the email disappeared into the ether. To her surprise, Aiden's reply came within the hour, far faster than she'd expected. His message was professional, detailed, offering insights on shading that she hadn't considered. But it was the last line that made her breath catch. "If you're free this weekend, stop by my private studio. I have some figure studies you should see in person. They might help." The invitation was casual, almost offhand, but it felt like a spark in the dark, a door cracked open just enough to let her glimpse what lay beyond. Elena read the email again, her fingers tracing the words on the screen as if they were his handwriting. She imagined his studio intimate, cluttered with canvases, lit by the soft glow of morning light. She imagined him there, sleeves rolled up, paint smudged on his knuckles, his eyes meeting hers across a room filled with art and secrets. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, a delicious mix of excitement and fear. She didn't know what she was stepping into, but she knew she couldn't say no, not to him. The rest of the week crawled by, each day a slow torture of anticipation. Elena went to her classes, sketched in her dorm, walked the rainy streets of Seattle, but her mind was always on Aiden, his voice, his touch, his invitation. She spent hours choosing what to wear, settling on a simple black dress that clung to her curves, the neckline low enough to reveal the delicate hollow of her throat, the hem short enough to show the long, graceful lines of her legs. She wanted to look effortless, but she wanted him to notice her, to see her not just as a student, but as a woman who could hold his gaze and match his fire. Saturday morning arrived, gray and damp, the city wrapped in a mist that felt like a secret shared between lovers. Elena stood outside Aiden's studio, a small loft in an old brick building near Pike Place Market. Her heart pounded as she climbed the narrow stairs, her boots echoing in the quiet. The door was ajar, and she pushed it open, stepping into a space that felt like stepping into Aiden's soul. The studio was everything she'd imagined and more. Sunlight poured through a wall of windows, painting the room in hues of gold and amber. Canvases leaned against every surface, some abstract, others figurative, all pulsing with emotion. The air smelled of oil paint and freshly brewed coffee, and in the center of the room stood Aiden, his back to her as he adjusted a canvas on an easel. He wore a white linen shirt, untucked and slightly rumpled, the fabric thin enough to hint at the contours of his back, the strong lines of his shoulders. His dark hair was tousled, as if he'd run his hands through it, and when he turned to face her, his eyes lit with something that made her breath catch a warmth, a hunger, a recognition. "Elena," he said, his voice low and welcoming, as if her name were a brushstroke he'd been waiting to paint. "I'm glad you came." She smiled, her lips parting slightly, her amber eyes meeting his with a boldness she hadn't known she possessed. "I wouldn't miss it," she said, and the words felt like a promise, a step across a line neither of them could uncross. The rain outside grew heavier, a steady drum against the windows, but inside the studio, the world was warm and alive, charged with the electricity of two people standing on the edge of something dangerous and beautiful. Elena set her bag down, her dress catching the light as she moved, and Aiden's gaze followed her, subtle but unmistakable. The space between them felt like a canvas, blank and waiting, ready for the first bold stroke. The rain had woven a cocoon around Seattle, its steady patter against the studio's tall windows creating a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. Inside Aiden Clarke's private loft, the world was a different kind of alive, warm, intimate, pulsing with the scent of oil, paint, cedar, and the dark, earthy aroma of freshly brewed coffee. The space was a sanctuary of chaos and beauty, every corner filled with the evidence of Aiden's life as an artist. Canvases stacked against brick walls, paint splattered tables, shelves groaning under the weight of art books and jars of brushes. Sunlight filtered through the rain-streaked glass, casting a golden glow that danced across the hardwood floor, turning the room into a living painting, all soft edges and radiant warmth. Elena Tran stood just inside the doorway, her black dress clinging to her slender frame like a second skin, the fabric catching the light in a way that highlighted the gentle curve of her hips, the delicate arc of her collarbone. The dress's neckline dipped low, revealing the smooth, golden expanse of her throat, where a faint pulse fluttered beneath her skin, betraying the nervous excitement she felt. Her long, jet-black hair fell in loose waves over one shoulder, framing her heart-shaped face, and her amber eyes large, luminous, and alive with curiosity, took in the studio with a hunger that matched the man who stood before her. She was 19, young enough to be reckless, old enough to know what she wanted, and in this moment, what she wanted was standing 6 feet away, his storm gray eyes locked on hers. Aiden turned from the easel he'd been adjusting, his white linen shirt slightly unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a glimpse of the strong, tanned chest beneath. The shirt was loose, but did little to hide the lean, muscular lines of his body, the broad shoulders that tapered to a narrow waist, the subtle flex of his biceps as he moved. His dark brown hair was tousled, a few strands falling across his forehead, and his jaw, dusted with stubble, was set in a way that suggested both control and something dangerously close to surrender. At 35, he was a man who had built walls around his heart, but the way he looked at Elena, his gaze, lingering on the curve of her lips, the way her dress hugged her thigh, hinted that those walls were beginning to crack. "Welcome to my chaos," he said, his voice low and warm, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It was a rare smile, one that softened the sharp angles of his face, making him seem less like the stern professor and more like a man who might let himself feel. He gestured to the studio, his scarred, calloused hand moving with the grace of someone who had spent years wielding a brush. "Make yourself at home." Elena stepped further into the room, her boots clicking softly against the floor, her movements deliberate, but laced with a quiet confidence. She set her bag down on a nearby table, her fingers brushing against a stack of sketches, and she felt a thrill at the thought of touching something so personal to him. "It's incredible," she said, her voice soft but clear, her eyes meeting his. "It feels alive, like every painting has a story." Aiden's smile deepened, and he tilted his head, studying her. "That's the goal," he said. "Art should breathe. It should make you feel something." His gaze held hers, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to thicken, charged with an unspoken question neither was ready to voice. Then he broke the silence, gesturing to a table where a pot of coffee sat steaming. "Coffee? Or are you more of a tea person?" "Coffee," she said, her lips curving into a small, playful smile. "Black, like my dress." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent a shiver down her spine, and poured her a mug. As he handed it to her, their fingers brushed, a fleeting touch that felt like a spark against her skin. His hands were warm, rough from years of work, and she couldn't help but notice the strength in them, the way his knuckles were slightly scarred, the veins that traced paths beneath his skin. She imagined those hands painting her, tracing her curves with the same care he gave to his canvases, and the thought made her cheeks flush, her breath catching in her throat. They sat at a small table near the windows, the rain a soft backdrop to their conversation. Aiden showed her a portfolio of figure study sketches of bodies in motion, bodies at rest, each line infused with emotion. Elena leaned closer, her shoulder brushing his as she studied the drawings, her eyes tracing the bold, confident strokes. "These are beautiful," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You make them feel so human." "That's the trick," he said, his voice low, his eyes on her rather than the sketches. "You have to see the person, not just the form. The way they hold themselves, the way they breathe, it's all part of the story." His gaze dropped to her hands, which rested on the table, her slender fingers wrapped around the coffee mug. "You have that in your work, Elena, a sensitivity. It's rare." Her heart skipped at the compliment, at the way he said her name, like it was a secret he was savoring. She looked up, meeting his eyes, and saw something their admiration, yes, but also a hunger, a curiosity that mirrored her own. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I'm trying to learn." to be braver with my lines. You're braver than you think, he said, and the words felt like a challenge, a dare to step closer to the edge they were both circling. The conversation shifted to art, to technique, to the way light and shadow could tell a story. Aiden suggested they draw together, a spontaneous exercise to loosen her up. You draw me, he said, standing and moving to the center of the room. I'll be your model. No pressure, just feel the lines. Elena's breath caught at the idea of sketching him, of studying him so openly. She nodded, grabbing her sketch pad and settling at an easel. Aiden struck a simple pose, one hand resting on his hip, the other raised slightly, his body relaxed but powerful. The linen shirt clung to his frame, hinting at the muscles beneath the broad chest, the taut abdomen, the strong lines of his thighs. His face was turned slightly, his jaw sharp in the sunlight, his gray eyes watching her with an intensity that made her hands tremble. She began to draw, her pencil moving across the page, capturing the angle of his shoulder, the curve of his neck. Her eyes lingered on the details, the way his collarbone cast a shadow, the faint scar above his eyebrow, the way his lips parted slightly as he breathed. She wanted to capture all of him, not just his form, but his essence, the quiet strength that drew her like a moth to a flame. Her strokes grew bolder, more confident, as if his presence were guiding her hand. Aiden watched her work, his gaze never wavering. He noticed the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way her lips parted as she breathed, the way her dress shifted with each movement, revealing the smooth golden skin of her thigh. She was beautiful, not in a loud, obvious way, but in a quiet, magnetic way that made it impossible to look away. Her hands moved with grace, her fingers delicate but sure, and he found himself imagining those hands on him, tracing the lines of his body as she did the paper. You're holding back again, he said after a while, his voice breaking the silence. He stepped away from his pose and crossed the room, his boots heavy against the floor. Your lines are strong, but they're still cautious. Let me show you. He moved behind her, his body close enough that she could feel the heat of him, the faint brush of his shirt against her back. He reached around her, his hand covering hers as he guided her pencil across the page. His touch was firm, deliberate, his fingers intertwining with hers in a way that felt more intimate than it should. His breath was warm against her neck, stirring the loose strands of her hair, and she felt a shiver run through her, a delicious ache that settled low in her belly. Like this, he murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. Don't think about the line, feel it. His hand moved hers in a slow, sweeping arc, but his body was closer now, his chest brushing her shoulder, his thigh grazing hers. She could smell him cedar, coffee, a hint of paint, and it was intoxicating, like stepping into a dream she didn't want to wake from. Elena didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, just slightly, her head tilting so that his breath grazed the sensitive skin of her neck. Her heart was a wild thing, pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. What if I get it wrong? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, laced with a playful challenge. Will you punish me? Aiden froze for a moment, his hand stilling on hers. Then he laughed, a low, dangerous sound that sent a thrill through her. That depends, he said, his voice darker now, his lips so close to her ear she could feel the warmth of them, on how badly you misbehave. The words hung in the air, heavy with possibility, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The rain outside seemed to fade, the world narrowing to the space between them, the heat of their bodies, the unspoken desire that crackled like static. Elena turned her head slightly, her cheek brushing his, and their eyes met theirs wide and burning, his hooded and stormy. She saw the conflict in his gaze, the battle between restraint and want, and she knew he saw the same in hers. Then, slowly, deliberately, Aiden released her hand and stepped back, his jaw tight, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're a quick learner," he said, his voice rough, as if he were forcing himself to speak. "Keep practicing. You'll get there." Elena nodded, her throat too tight to respond. She felt the absence of his touch like a physical ache, her skin still tingling where his hand had been. She wanted to reach for him, to close the distance, but she sensed the line he was trying to hold, the boundary he was fighting to maintain. So she turned back to her sketch, her pencil moving across the page, but her mind was elsewhere, on the man standing just out of reach, on the way his breath had felt against her skin, on the promise hidden in his words. The rest of the morning passed in a haze of drawing and conversation, the tension between them a constant undercurrent, like a melody neither could ignore. They spoke of art, of life, of the way a single line could change everything, but every word felt like a dance, every glance a brushstroke on a canvas they were painting together. When it was time for her to leave, Aiden walked her to the door, his hand hovering at the small of her back, not quite touching, but close enough to make her pulse race. "Thank you," she said, turning to face him, her amber eyes searching his. "For today, for everything." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, then nodded. "Come back anytime," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "The door's always open." Elena stepped into the rain, her dress clinging to her skin as the cool droplets kissed her face, but she felt warm, alive, as if she'd left a piece of herself in that studio and taken something of Aiden with her. She didn't know where this was leading, but she knew one thing for certain. The line between them was blurring, and she wasn't sure she wanted to redraw it. The rain had softened to a mist, cloaking Seattle in a gossamer veil that shimmered under the streetlights. Inside Aiden Clarke's private studio, the world was a different kind of storm electric, alive, teetering on the edge of something irrevocable. The loft was a constellation of light and shadow, its tall windows catching the faint glow of the city outside, while candles flickered on scattered tables, their flames dancing to the rhythm of the rain. The air was heavy with the scent of oil, paint, cedar, and the lingering warmth of coffee. But beneath it all was something newer, primal, unspoken tension that pulsed between the two people, standing in the center of the room. Elena Tran was a vision, her black dress, a silken shadow that clung to her body, accentuating every curve, every delicate line. The fabric hugged the gentle swell of her hips, the slender taper of her waist, and dipped low at her chest, revealing the smooth, golden expanse of her décolletage, where a faint flush bloomed beneath her skin. Her long, jet-black hair cascaded over her shoulders, catching the candlelight in a way that made it shimmer like liquid obsidian. Her amber eyes, wide and luminous, held a fire that was both vulnerable and bold, a contradiction that made her impossible to look away from. At 19, she was a woman on the cusp of discovery, her body a canvas of youth and desire, her heart a brush dipped in reckless courage. Aiden Clarke stood across from her, his white linen shirt unbuttoned just enough to reveal the strong, tanned planes of his chest, the faint dusting of dark hair that trailed downward, hinting at the power beneath. At 35, he was a man carved from experience, his lean, muscular frame a testament to years spent wrestling with art and life. His dark brown hair was tousled, streaked with the faintest gray, and his jaw, shadowed with stubble, was set in a way that suggested both restraint and a dangerous hunger. His storm gray eyes were locked on Elena, drinking her in with an intensity that made the air between them crackle. His hands scarred, calloused, strong-flexed at his sides, as if fighting the urge to reach for her. The studio was a chaos of unfinished canvases, each one a burst of color and emotion. But tonight, the only art that mattered was the one they were creating together. They had been drawing, as they had earlier, with Aiden posing and Elena sketching, but the exercise had shifted, the lines on the paper blurring as the lines between them dissolved. They had laughed, talked, their voices weaving a delicate dance, but every word, every glance was a step closer to the edge. It began with a Tusha moment when Aiden, standing behind her, adjusted her grip on the pencil, his hand lingering on hers, his breath warm against her neck. The memory of that touch still burned, a spark that had grown into a flame. Now, as they stood facing each other, the candlelight casting shadows across their faces, the tension was a living thing, a pulse that matched the rain outside. "Elena," Aiden said, his voice low, rough, like gravel underfoot. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them, his tall frame looming over her, his presence as commanding as ever. "You're making it hard to stay professional." Her lips curved into a small, daring smile, her eyes never leaving his. "Maybe I don't want you to," she said, her voice soft but steady, laced with a challenge that made his breath catch. She tilted her head slightly, her hair falling over one shoulder, exposing the elegant curve of her neck, the soft hollow where her pulse fluttered like a trapped bird. Aiden's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening as he took another step, so close now that she could feel the heat of him, the faint scent of cedar and paint that clung to his skin. His hand rose, hesitating for a moment before his fingers brushed her cheek, tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that belied the hunger in his gaze. Her skin was silk under his touch, warm and smooth, and he marveled at the contrast her delicate frame against his roughness, her youth against his experience. His thumb grazed her lower lip, and she parted her lips slightly, her breath hitching, her eyes half-lidded with want. "God, Elena," he murmured, his voice a raw edge of need. "You have no idea what you're doing to me." "Then show me," she whispered, her words a spark to tinder, and that was all it took. The first kiss was not hurried, but deep, deliberate, like a brushstroke meant to last. Aiden's lips found hers, soft at first, testing, tasting, then harder, hungrier, as if he were pouring every unspoken thought into the press of his mouth. Elena melted into him, her hands sliding up his chest, fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt, feeling the heat of his skin beneath. His body was a landscape of strength-broad shoulders, taut muscles, the hard plane of his abdomen pressing against her softer curves. She arched into him, her breasts brushing his chest, the friction sending a shiver through her, a delicious ache that settled low in her belly. Aiden's hands moved, one sliding to the small of her back, pulling her closer, the other tangling in her hair, tilting her head to deepen the kiss. His lips were warm, demanding, tasting of coffee and something darker, something uniquely him. She moaned softly, the sound swallowed by his mouth, and he growled in response, a low, primal sound that made her knees weak. Her hands roamed, exploring the contours of his body, The strong lines of his arms, the dip of his spine, the way his hips pressed against hers, a promise of what was to come. The kiss broke, but only for a moment, their foreheads resting together, breaths mingling, ragged and heavy. Aiden's eyes searched hers, a storm of desire and conflict. "We shouldn't," he said, but his voice lacked conviction, his hand still holding her close, one thumb tracing slow circles against her hip. "Then why does it feel so right?" Elena asked, her voice a whisper, her lips brushing his as she spoke. She pressed herself closer, her body molding to his, the soft swell of her breasts against his chest, the curve of her thigh against his. She was all warmth and want, her skin flushed, her eyes burning with a fire that matched his own. That was his undoing. With a low curse, Aiden kissed her again, harder this time, his hands roaming with purpose. He lifted her effortlessly, her legs wrapping around his waist, her dress riding up to reveal the smooth, golden skin of her thighs. She was light in his arms, but her presence was heavy, filling every corner of his mind. He carried her to a nearby table, setting her down gently, his hands sliding up her sides, tracing the curve of her waist, the delicate arch of her ribs. Her dress was a tease, clinging to her body, and he wanted nothing more than to peel it away, to see her as he'd imagined her bare, beautiful, his. Elena's hands were just as bold, tugging at his shirt, pulling it free to reveal the hard planes of his chest, the faint scars that told stories she wanted to learn. Her fingers traced the lines of his muscles, the taut skin of his abdomen, and she marveled at the power in him, the way his body responded to her touch. She leaned forward, pressing soft kisses to his collarbone, her lips warm and teasing, and he groaned, his hands tightening on her hips, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. The night unfolded like a painting, each moment a brushstroke, hands finding skin, lips tracing curves, breaths mingling in the candlelit dark. Aiden's touch was reverent but hungry, his fingers mapping the contours of her body, the soft swell of her breasts, the dip of her waist, the smooth expanse of her thighs. Elena was a revelation, her skin warm and yielding, her moans a melody that drove him wild. She arched beneath him, her hair spilling across the table like ink, her eyes locked on his, wide and trusting, yet fierce with desire. Their bodies moved together, a dance of need and surrender, skin against skin, heat against heat. Aiden was careful, attentive, his hands and lips worshiping her, but there was an edge to him, a rawness that matched the fire in her. Elena met him with equal passion, her nails grazing his back, her legs pulling him closer, her voice a soft plea in the dark. The world outside ceased to exist there, was only this room, this moment, this collision of two souls who had fought the pull for too long. When it was over, they lay tangled together on the floor, a blanket pulled over them, the candles burning low. Elena's head rested on Aiden's chest, her hair fanning across his skin, her breath warm and steady. His arm was around her, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder, and for a moment they were just two people, unbound by rules or consequences, lost in the afterglow of something real. The rain continued outside, a soft lullaby, but the warmth of their bodies, the quiet rhythm of their breaths, was all that mattered. They didn't speak, not yet words felt too small for what had passed between them. But as Aiden looked down at Elena, her face soft in the candlelight, her lips still swollen from his kisses, he knew one thing for certain. This was no mistake. It was art, messy and beautiful, and he wasn't ready to let it go. The Seattle dawn crept into Aiden Clarke's studio like a shy lover, its pale light slipping through the tall windows, softening the edges of the room. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a quiet that felt sacred, broken only by the distant hum of the city waking up. The loft was a tapestry of shadows and glow, the hardwood floor strewn with scattered sketches, paintbrushes, and the remnants of last night's candles, now burned to stubs. The air still carried the faint scent of oil paint and cedar, but it was mingled now with the intimate warmth of two bodies, their breaths a soft rhythm in the stillness. Elena Tran lay curled against Aiden, her head resting on his chest, her long jet-black hair spilling across his skin like ink on a canvas. A thin blanket draped over them, barely covering the smooth, golden curve of her shoulder, the delicate arc of her spine. Her skin was warm, kissed by the dawn's light, and it glowed with a softness that made her seem almost ethereal, a dream made flesh. At 19, her body was a study in contrast, slender, yet strong, youthful yet knowing. The gentle swell of her hips, the soft dip of her waist, the way her legs tangled with his, all spoke of a woman who had stepped boldly into desire and now rested in its afterglow. Her face, relaxed in sleep, was heart-shaped and serene, her full lips slightly parted, her lashes casting delicate shadows on her cheeks. Even in repose, her amber eyeshadow now held a spark that lingered in Aiden's mind, a fire that had burned through his defenses. Aiden lay awake, one arm curled around Elena, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her bare shoulder. At 35, he was a man of sharp angles and quiet strength, his lean, muscular frame a testament to years spent hiking the rugged trails of the Pacific Northwest and wrestling with the demands of his art. His dark brown hair, streaked with the faintest gray, was tousled from the night, falling across his forehead in a way that softened his otherwise stern features. His jaw, shadowed with stubble, was set in thought, and his storm gray eyes, usually piercing and guarded, were softer now, fixed on the woman in his arms. His chest, broad and tanned, bore faint scars from a life well lived, and the steady beat of his heart beneath Elena's cheek was a quiet anchor in the morning's hush. He wore nothing but the blanket, his body a landscape of power and vulnerability, every line telling a story of restraint and release. The floor beneath them was cool, but their shared warmth made it irrelevant. The studio, with its chaos of canvases and paint-splattered tables, felt like a cocoon, a space where the rules of the outside world didn't apply. Last night had been a wildfire, a collision of need and surrender that had left them both breathless, their bodies painting a story no canvas could hold. Now, in the quiet aftermath, Aiden's mind was a tangle of awe and unease. He looked down at Elena, her face peaceful, her breath a soft caress against his skin, and felt a pang of something he hadn't allowed himself in years' tenderness, raw and unguarded. He shifted slightly, careful not to wake her, and the movement made the blanket slip, revealing more of her body, the smooth curve of her back, the gentle flare of her hips, the long, graceful lines of her legs. She was beautiful, not in a loud, performative way, but in a quiet, magnetic way that made his chest ache. Her skin was a canvas of golden warmth, dusted with the faintest freckles across her shoulders, and he wanted to trace them, to memorize every inch of her. But as his fingers brushed her arm, a shadow crossed his mind, the reality of who they were, of the lines they'd crossed, of the consequences that loomed like storm clouds on the horizon. Elena stirred, her lashes fluttering as she woke, her amber eyes opening to meet his. They were bright, even in the soft light, filled with a warmth that made his breath catch. She smiled, a slow, sleepy curve of her lips that was both innocent and knowing, and stretched slightly, her body arching against his in a way that sent a jolt of desire through him. Despite the night they'd shared, "Morning," she murmured, her voice husky, laced with the remnants of sleep and satisfaction. "Morning," Aiden replied, his voice low, a rumble that vibrated through his chest. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering on her cheek, marveling at the softness of her skin, the way it seemed to glow under his touch. "You sleep okay?" "Better than okay," she said, her smile widening, her eyes sparkling with mischief. She propped herself up on one elbow, the blanket slipping further to reveal the curve of her breast, the delicate line of her collarbone. She was unself-conscious, her body a quiet confidence, and Aiden couldn't look away, his gaze tracing the contours of her form, committing them to memory like a sketch he'd never dare put to paper. They lay there for a moment, the silence between them comfortable but heavy, with unspoken questions. The dawn light painted patterns across Elena's back, intricate shadows that danced like lace, and Aiden's hand moved instinctively, tracing the lines with a reverence that felt almost sacred. Her skin was warm, yielding, and she shivered under his touch, her eyes darkening with a flicker of the fire that had consumed them last night. "You're staring," she teased, her voice soft but playful, her lips quirking as she watched him. "Can you blame me?" he said, his tone matching hers, but there was an edge to it, a weight that hinted at the thoughts he wasn't voicing. "You're something else, Elena." She tilted her head, studying him, her hair falling over one shoulder like a curtain of silk. "Something else," she echoed, her smile fading slightly, as if she sensed the shift in him. "That's a good thing, right?" He nodded, but his jaw tightened, his fingers stilling on her shoulder. He wanted to say more, to tell her how she'd unraveled him, how she'd made him feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. But the words caught in his throat, tangled with the reality of their situation teacher and student, a 15-year age gap, a scandal waiting to happen. He'd sworn to himself he'd never cross this line again, not after the wreckage of his marriage, the whispers that had followed. Yet here he was, with Elena in his arms, her warmth seeping into him, her eyes searching his for answers he wasn't sure he could give. "Aiden," she said, her voice quieter now, her hand resting on his chest, her fingers tracing the faint scar above his heart. "What's wrong?" He looked at her, his gray eyes stormy, conflicted. "I swore I wouldn't do this again," he said, his voice raw, almost a whisper. "Not with a student, not with anyone. It's complicated." Elena's brow furrowed, but her touch didn't falter, her fingers still warm against his skin. She sat up slightly, the blanket pooling around her waist, her body a vision of grace and strength in the morning light. "Complicated," she repeated, her tone gentle but firm. "But you didn't do this alone. I wanted it. I chose it." She leaned closer, her lips brushing his jaw, a soft, deliberate kiss that made his breath hitch. "I chose you." Her words were a spark, igniting something in him, a mix of awe and fear, desire, and guilt. He caught her wrist, his grip gentle but firm, and pulled her closer, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was slow, deep, filled with everything he couldn't say. Her mouth was warm, yielding, tasting of last night's coffee and the sweetness of her, and she kissed him back with a fierceness that matched his own. Her hands slid up his chest, tangling in his hair, and for a moment, the world was just them, skin against skin, heart against heart, a fragile, perfect moment. But the kiss ended, and reality crept back in, as relentless as the dawn. Aiden pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, his breath ragged. "Elena," he said, his voice strained, "if this gets out, my career, my reputation, it could all go up in flames, and you could get hurt more than you realize." She looked at him, her amber eyes steady, unflinching. "I'm not a child, Aiden," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "I know what this is. I know the risks. But last night, it was real. It wasn't just a moment. It was us." Her words hit him like a brushstroke, bold and undeniable, and he felt his resolve waver. He wanted to believe her, to hold on to this feeling, to let himself fall into the possibility of them. But the weight of his past, the rules of the world they lived in, pressed against him, a reminder of the cost of recklessness. They lay there a while longer, talking in low voices, their bodies still entwined. Elena spoke of her dream-sure love for design, her fear of failing, the way art made her feel alive. Aiden listened, his hand stroking her hair, and shared pieces of himself's his divorce, the loneliness that had settled into his bones, the way her sketches had caught his eye from the first day. They laughed, they kissed, they held each other, and for those hours, the studio was a world where nothing else mattered. But as the morning wore on, the light grew brighter, and the reality of the day loomed. They dressed slowly, their movements reluctant, stealing glances and touches, as if to memorize each other. Elena's dress was rumpled, but still clung to her like a lover, accentuating the curves Aiden now knew by heart. He pulled on his jeans and a fresh shirt, the fabric stretching across his broad shoulders, and watched her with a quiet intensity, his gray eyes filled with a longing he couldn't hide. At the door, they paused, the weight of goodbye heavy between them. Elena reached up, her fingers brushing his jaw, her touch a promise and a question. "This doesn't have to be the end," she said, her voice soft but sure. Aiden caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm, his lips warm against her skin. "I don't want it to be," he said, his voice raw. "But we need to be careful, for both our sakes." She nodded, her eyes searching his, and then she kissed him one last, lingering kiss that held all the fire and tenderness of the night before. Then she stepped into the morning, the cool air kissing her flushed cheeks, her heart full and heavy with the weight of what they'd shared. As she walked away, the city waking around her, Elena felt alive, her body humming with the memory of Aiden's touch, his voice, his warmth. She didn't know what came next, but she knew one thing. She wasn't afraid, not of him, not of this, not of the risks. She'd chosen him, and she'd choose him again, no matter what the world might say. The Seattle winter had settled in, wrapping the city in a chill that seeped into bones and hearts alike. The streets of Capitol Hill were slick with frost, the air sharp with the promise of snow, and the world felt quieter, as if holding its breath. Months had passed since that night in Aiden Clarke's studio, a night that had burned itself into Elena Tran's soul like a brushstroke on canvas, vivid, indelible, and achingly real. The memory of it lingered in her skin, in the way her heart quickened at the scent of cedar or the sight of a candle's flicker. But it was a memory she carried alone, tucked away like a sketch in a hidden notebook. Elena had stopped attending the nude art class, her absence a silent agreement between her and Aiden, a way to protect what they'd shared from the prying eyes of the world. She threw herself into her studies at the University of Washington, her design projects becoming bolder, more expressive, as if the fire of that night had spilled into her work. At 19, she was a vision of quiet strength, her slender frame draped in a navy coat that hugged her curves, accentuating the delicate taper of her waist and the graceful lines of her legs. Her jet black hair was pulled into a loose braid, strands escaping to frame her heart-shaped face, and her amber eyes large, luminous, and always searching held a depth that hadn't been there before. They were eyes that had seen passion, felt loss, and learned to carry both with grace. Aiden, too, had retreated into his world. At 35, he remained the enigmatic artist, his lean, muscular frame a constant in the studio, his dark brown hair now a touch longer, curling slightly at the nape of his neck. His storm gray eyes, once so piercing, were quieter now, shadowed by thoughts he kept locked away. He taught his classes with the same intensity, his voice a low rumble that commanded attention, but there was a distance in him, a wall rebuilt to protect himself and her. His hands, scarred and strong, still wielded a brush with precision, but they ached for something they couldn't hold, a warmth they'd known only once, in a loft lit by candles and rain. They hadn't spoken since that morning, their silence a mutual choice, born of necessity rather than desire. No texts, no emails, no chance encounters in the city's crowded streets. It was as if they'd agreed to let the memory of that night stand alone, a perfect, untouchable moment that could neither be repeated nor erased. But the absence of each other was a weight, a quiet ache that colored their days, like a painting left unfinished, its edges raw and yearning. Elena had tried to move on, filling her life with friends, classes, late-night coffee runs, but Aiden was a shadow in her thoughts, a presence she couldn't shake. She saw him in the lines of her sketches, in the way light fell through her dorm window, in the fleeting moments when she caught a stranger's profile and thought, for a heartbeat, it was him. Her body remembered him, the press of his lips, the roughness of his hands, the way his chest had felt beneath her cheek, and it was a memory that made her ache, a longing that was both sweet and painful. Aiden, too, carried her with him, though he'd never admit it, not even to himself. He saw her in the faces of his students, in the delicate lines of their drawings, in the way a woman's laughter echoed through a cafe. His studio, once a sanctuary, felt emptier now, the canvases that lined its walls a reminder of a night when art had been more than paint and paper. He painted with a ferocity that bordered on obsession, his work darker, more abstract, as if trying to exorcise her from his soul. But she was there, in every stroke, every shadow, a muse he couldn't escape. It was late December when their paths crossed again, not by design but by chance, in a way that felt like fate's quiet intervention. The Seattle Art Museum was hosting a winter exhibition, a showcase of local artists, and Aiden's work was among the featured pieces. Elena, on a whim, had decided to attend, drawn by a need she couldn't name, a pull toward the art that had always been her refuge. She wore a deep burgundy dress, its soft fabric clinging to her body, the neckline low enough to reveal the smooth curve of her collarbone, the hem brushing her knees to show the elegant lines of her calves. Her hair was loose, falling in waves that caught the gallery's soft lighting, and her amber eyes were bright, searching as she moved through the crowd. The exhibition was a labyrinth of color and emotion, paintings and sculptures filling the space with stories of love, loss, and everything in between. Elena wandered slowly, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, her heart a quiet drumbeat as she studied each piece. She felt alive here, surrounded by art, but there was a restlessness in her, a sense that something was missing, something she was chasing without knowing why. Then she saw Ida painting, large and commanding, hung in a quiet corner of the gallery. It was unmistakably Aiden's, its bold, abstract lines softened by a tenderness that made her breath catch. The canvas was a swirl of deep blues and golds, like a stormy sea kissed by sunlight. But at its center was a figure, unmistakable even in its abstraction, a young woman. Her form suggested, rather than defined, holding a paintbrush. Her posture was confident, her head tilted as if looking directly at the viewer, and her eyes, though not detailed, burned with a fire that Elena recognized. It was her, or some version of her, captured in a way that felt both intimate and universal, a portrait of a moment that had changed them both. Beneath the painting, a small plaque bore its title, "She looked at me like I was art, and I became it." The words hit Elena like a wave, stealing her breath, making her heart stutter. She stood frozen, her eyes tracing the lines of the painting, her mind replaying that night, the candles, the rain, the way Aiden's hands had felt on her skin, the way his voice had wrapped around her like a caress. The painting was a confession, a declaration, a piece of him laid bare for the world to see, and it was for her. She didn't notice Aiden at first, didn't see him standing across the gallery, his tall frame leaning against a pillar, his gray eyes fixed on her. He wore a dark blazer over a white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal his scarred forearms, his hair slightly tousled, his jaw tight with emotion. He'd seen her the moment she entered, had watched her move through the crowd, her burgundy dress a beacon in the sea of faces. She was more beautiful than he remembered, her presence a quiet fire that warmed the cold corners of his heart. He wanted to go to her, to speak her name, to bridge the distance they'd built, but he held back, his hands clenched at his sides, torn between desire and duty. Elena felt his gaze before she saw him, a prickle of awareness that made her turn. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, the world fell away, the chatter of the crowd, the hum of the gallery, the weight of the months apart. His gray eyes were a storm, filled with longing and restraint, and hers were a fire, burning with questions and truths. She took a step toward him, then stopped, her heart pounding, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. He mirrored her, a single step, then a pause, as if they were both afraid to break the fragile thread that still connected them. The moment stretched, heavy with possibility, a canvas waiting for a stroke. Would they speak? Would they close the distance, risk everything for another taste of what they'd had? Or would they let the silence hold, let the painting be their only conversation, a goodbye wrapped in beauty? Elena's lips parted, as if to say something, but no words came. Aiden's hand twitched, as if reaching for her, but it fell back to his side. They were two figures in a gallery, surrounded by art, but the real masterpiece was the unspoken story between them, a story that wasn't finished, Not yet. She turned back to the painting, her eyes lingering on the title, on the woman who was and wasn't her. A single tear slipped down her cheek, catching the light, and she brushed it away quickly, her smile bittersweet. She didn't look at Aiden again, not because she didn't want to, but because she knew if she did, she wouldn't be able to walk away. She moved through the gallery, her steps slow, her heart heavy with a nostalgia that felt like love, and stepped out into the winter night, the cold air kissing her flushed skin. Aiden watched her go, his chest tight, his hands aching to paint, to capture this moment, this feeling. He didn't follow her, but he knew this wasn't the end, not of her, not of them. The painting was a promise, a whisper of what could be, and he'd wait, as long as it took, for the next stroke of their story. Elena walked through the frost-kissed streets, the city alive around her, her breath visible in the cold. She didn't know what came next, didn't know if she'd see Aiden again, if they'd find a way to be more than a memory. But as she looked up at the starless sky, she felt a spark of something, hope, perhaps, or defiance. Their story wasn't over. And somewhere, in another gallery, another studio, another moment, it would continue. What happens next? Will Elena and Aiden defy the rules? Or will their love remain a painting, beautiful but untouchable? Stay tuned to my channel for the next chapter of their story, where passion and consequences collide in ways you won't see coming.